Thank you for joining us here this evening. As was mentioned, I am a researcher and a geneticist, and my day job is in the lab doing molecular biology and cattle breeding. So what the heck am I doing out here talking about this? And I hope that you'll see that I get that if scientists don't get out and talk to the general public, we are going to lose access to technology, and I may as well not do my research. And this debate around food technologies has actually pretty much precluded my entire career from using certain breeding methods to improve cattle. And so it's very personal in that regard, but also it's very frustrating because what I see the discussions in the general public are kind of so out of whack with where the science is. And trying to get that connect is such a hard thing to do because most people find scientists pretty boring, because many of them are. And they present in a very boring way, and they have a hard time getting their message across because they present as if they're presenting to all their nerdy academic friends who are data geeks, and most humans aren't like that. And so we have to change our style. So I have a picture up here on the board of a Bangladeshi farmer who's just harvested some BT eggplant. This is a product that was just approved a couple of years ago, and it's protected from insects, specifically caterpillars, and those of you that grow BT crops will know exactly what I'm talking about here. But I have it up here because this debate around this technology has actually more or less stopped that technology being adopted in Bangladesh for about 20 years. And just recently they've been able to use the technology, and in the case of eggplant, they were prior to that spraying those eggplants about every 3 days with insecticides, and in that country there are no personal protective equipment. They're walking along spraying with nothing on other than their clothes. And I think that really to me is what makes me passionate about this topic, because this discussion in the first world has these huge implications in the developing world, and the world where really this technology is perhaps the most needed. So that's my reason why I'm here tonight, but I guess more generally, I wanted to frame the discussion here around the fact that there's been always pushback against technological innovations. And so I have a quote here. It's unknown what the long-term health impacts are going to be and what consequences may unfold. The studies are not adequate. Furthermore, it'll likely not be available or cost-effective for small farmers, and it'll decrease product acceptance and consumption. Does anybody want to hazard a guess as to what technology this quote has to do with? Could be lots of different things, right? Irradiation, GMOs, pink slime. It's an introduction from the Pasteurized Milk Ordinance back in 1924. And we may take that for granted, but back then, if you look in 1900s, about 10% of all TB cases came from drinking contaminated unpasteurized milk. And when pasteurization came, it was really a miracle. And back even in the 30s, raw milk was responsible for about 25% of all food and waterborne outbreaks, and it resulted in an incredible number of infant deaths. We don't see those anymore. That scourge is gone because we now pasteurize our milk. And the data is quite clear that you're about 150 times more likely to get sick from drinking raw milk than pasteurized milk. We should be done with this topic, but we're not. We're not done with this topic. And I Googled this and pulled up the first thing that I Googled today. So this is not anything new, but there's this pasteurized versus raw milk, which one is healthier for you or your family, by what appears like a reasonable source. It's a doctor, got a whole bunch of alphabets after his name. He must be good, right? And so I started to read it. The fuss about raw milk has to do with pathogens. Correct, that's correct. Organisms that can cause diseases such as salmonella. Tick. So far I'm on board, looking good. But whether or not raw milk carries pathogens depends on the way milk is produced, how the animals are fed, and the care that's taken to keep the milk clean during production. Started to lose me a little bit there, buddy. That's actually not true. Today's pasteurized milk comes from cows crammed into cages. Cages? What are the cows doing in cages? They're not chickens. And they're loaded with synthetic hormones. Okay, my BS meter is starting to go up because BST hasn't been on the market for a number of years. And antibiotics, why are they crammed with antibiotics? You are not allowed to sell milk with antibiotics in it. It's actually illegal. You can treat sick animals, but they have a withdrawal period. So right about now, I'm starting to call BS on this. Homogenization purposely destroys raw milk's natural butter fat to separate and hide the cream from the consumer. What? Are you guys scared of cream? I mean, like, cream is basically the fat, right? And so if you buy, like, non-fat milk, there's no cream hiding there. It's gone. And if you buy 2% milk, it's 2% fat. And whole milk is 4% or something, right? So we're not really doing that. European studies show that this is dangerous and may cause heart disease. What are you even talking about? Then there's got a reference. That's happy. Of course, our FDA disputes. Well, of course they do, because they're in on this conspiracy with those bad big milk people. Homogenized milk is quite unnatural. Back in the 20s, Americans could buy raw milk, clean grass-fed milk and cheese, and at that time, milk-borne diseases were rare. Hang on that previous slide, I just showed you 25% of all outbreaks were due to unpasteurized milk. Can you believe the supplies of organic raw milk today are required to display the words "not fit for human consumption"? Yes, I can believe that because it's not fit for human consumption. It is, it's true. I firmly believe that's true. Health starts in the colon. Raw milk contains the milk sugar lactose in its purest form, and lactose aids in digestion, and organic raw milk is the only food that has this in a usable form. I do not consume animal milk, but if I did, I would only consume raw goat milk. So here's a gentleman who himself has no intention of drinking milk of any sort, let alone raw milk, who's advising you to give your children raw milk. And you know what the tragedy is? Because people don't know what raw milk can do, there is probably one of the most horrifying pages on the internet is this page called rawmilkfacts.com. And if you go on there, there are these tragic stories of parents who gave their kids raw milk. The kids got infections that destroyed their kidneys. These kids have lifelong disabilities, paralysis. And these parents said, nobody told me. And I look at that and I'm like, how can you not know that? But these are honest parents trying to do the right thing by their kids who've been misled by apparently credible sources. And I think we run into that a lot in this food debate because people put themselves across as being a credible source when they're not. So in terms of actual food safety risks, what's most likely to kill you on the list in this here? Consuming GMOs, foodborne pathogens, trace level of pesticides, be they natural, organic or synthetic, or purchasing conventional food rather than organic. Does anybody want to take a guess? Yes? B, clearly B, kills thousands of people every year. You know, cook your meat, wash your food. It's not that hard. But the thing is that we have this new era of social media where we have apparently credible sources that had a doctor and an alphabet soup, must be reasonable, who has a little bit of truth to what they start out with. So yeah, the problem is that it's bacteria in the milk, but then go on with a whole bunch of stuff that's meant to go to your emotions that really creates this conspiracy theory where it's us versus them. So they, be they big food, big egg, big milk, big agronomics, big whoever, are working against everything we, this group, my friends, have worked so hard to build, and they don't care about it. Make no mistake, they're the enemy. And that kind of the enemy versus David Goliath story, it's as old as every fairy tale you've ever read to your children. And you hear a lot of anecdotal information and storytelling, inspirational quotes, vivid language, and most importantly, fear-mongering. And I put on the slide here some real classics at this that do it very well. Jenny McCarthy as it relates to vaccinations, Zen Honeycutt as it relates to GMOs and glyphosate, and Food Babe as it relates to chemicals in food. And they have got the art of the scare down, and they've basically found out how to monetize fear. And it's very basic, very difficult to counter these narratives with facts. Because if I just told you that your kid's going to get cancer and I go, no, it's fine. You can't turn that off in your brain. Once you've heard something terrifying, it's really hard to get that out of your mind, and it's very hard to reassure people. And if there's a little hint that maybe your kid might get autism if you vaccinate them, and you've never seen what not vaccinating looks like, you've never seen polio, then it's very easy for these people to get their messages across. And as it relates to food, I find that there's a real disconnect between people's kind of understanding of food and how easy it is to spin people on the sustainable food definition. So for this audience, I thought that I'm going to ask you, okay, in this crowd here tonight, I'm going to show you a scenario of 3 different ways to raise pigs, because we're in Iowa, and why not talk about pig raising? So there's 3 systems here. 1 is up here, 2 is down here, and 3 is over here. And basically, I want you to just look at them, and in your brain, think to yourself, which is the most sustainable system? I'm not going to put you on the spot and make you put up your hand as to which one you think is the most sustainable system, but I want you all to pick your number, 1, 2, 3. Has everyone got their number picked? All right, remember that number. And now we're going to talk about what sustainability is. And most people kind of understand this to be some sort of intersection between economic viability and cost of food, the environment, and some social aspects, which includes things like worker fairness and animal welfare and that type of stuff. And there's this kind of little nirvana in the middle there that everybody should aspire towards. However, that nirvana is very difficult to attain because those 3 pillars kind of pull against each other. And what might be the most environmentally friendly might be perhaps not the most economically viable for a farmer, or it might make particularly expensive produce for the consumer. And so there's always these kind of trade-offs, and so it's really difficult to get systems that fit in here. And there's almost always these goal conflicts between environment, social, and economic goals, and because each scenario fulfilled different aspects of sustainability, there was no scenario that fulfilled all 3 simultaneously. We didn't really reach the white nirvana in the middle of that circle, and so we have to kind of do these evaluations in our head. But what's happening is that this gets left to a political process, and it kind of exposes the processes to subjective interpretation and political pressure from special interest groups who have one pillar of sustainability as their main driving feature. That they don't really care about the economics or the environment. Animal welfare is their one thing, or they don't care about any of that, they just care about the environment. And it doesn't really have for a very, I would call it, grown-up conversation around the best way to produce our food. And the sustainable label definition, I love this definition because it's like, it's a way of raising food that is healthy for consumers and animals, does not harm the environment, humane for workers, respects animals, provides a fair wage to the farmer, and supports and enhances rural communities. Who couldn't love that? But I'd like world peace added on the end, just whilst we're at it, right? And so it does become a little bit of a kind of a gishgalop of all these different sustainability labels that kind of go at you when you're in the supermarket, which makes it really hard for the average consumer to know what the heck they should do. Because I think most consumers are interested in primarily, number 1, food safety, but also they want to do the right thing by the environment. They're driven by that. And yet, which of these should they follow if they want to do the right thing? And I think that's where the confusion goes. And so I'm just going to talk about 3 different technologies which have been much maligned in the media and that many people try to intentionally avoid in our production systems. It's prohibited in certain production systems like organic. And ask if removing these technologies from our food production systems has actually had the net sustainability benefit that you would believe based on what you've been told. And I'm going to use this one, which is a very controversial technology that was introduced right when I started at UC Davis 22, 23 years ago. It's recombinant bovine somatotropin, which was given to dairy cows that increased their productivity. And so there was a lot of, if you will remember, activist groups out there saying that it would give you cancer and a whole bunch of information that wasn't supported by the scientific literature, but it sounded really frightening, and of course milk is very important food that you give to your children. I think that's what my kids lived on in terms of protein growing up. And so to kind of cast aspersions on the healthfulness of such a key component of childhood nutrition really got a whole group of dairies saying, you know what, we're going to not have that, and then we're going to label our product as not containing milk from recombinant bovine somatotropin, and we'll get a market advantage from that because we won't have used that. And so this particular ad is like, got hormones? We don't. All of our milk is natural from cows that are not treated with the hormone recombinant bovine somatotropin. And so there was this kind of split in the marketplace. And eventually that split got to where all of the creameries in America said, we're not going to take milk from cows that have been treated with recombinant bovine somatotropin anymore. There was no difference in the milk. That's what the FDA studies clearly showed. And so now that technology is gone. So that market advantage for absence labeling is no longer there because everything says it doesn't have that. But the technology's gone too. And if you look on average, what's the real impact on the other components of sustainability? On average now, a glass of milk in the US is about an increase of 7% in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the production of a glass of milk, because people were willing to market this and basically increase their short-term sales to remove a perfectly safe technology from the market. Has that improved the sustainability of agriculture? I would argue not. Certainly people got a short-term market advantage, but if we do this to more and more technologies, at what stage are we actually going to make it really less productive and less efficient in our agricultural production systems? The next topic I'm going to discuss, and any of you that are my age will know exactly what this is about. So this is Jan, who's complaining about Marsha, right? So she was the oldest Brady Bunch child, and everything was about her, and poor old Jan was upset about that. And I feel a little bit like that with pesticides at the moment. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm over it. And I'm an animal geneticist, right? Like, why is this even a thing? I just see so much fear-mongering around this topic. And if you actually look at the data, it's such a good news story that I don't even know why it's a discussion. So a study that examined some 200 investigations on diet and cancer using cohort studies, what was the major factor that cut rates to virtually half of all the major cancers? Avoiding GMOs, eating only organic food, a diet high in fruits and vegetables, avoiding pesticides, or avoiding sugar. C, by a long shot. So Grandma was right. Eat your fruits and vegetables and don't worry about the production system, and don't worry about the trace levels of pesticides. When the Environmental Working Group puts out their dirty dozen, they are trying to frighten you. And if you look at the data, this is not an issue. And so why do I had to put that up last. All of this is peer reviewed, by the way, so this is where I got that data from, but if I put that up first, I would have given the answer away. But are natural pesticides safer than synthetic pesticides? So you might go, what? Natural pesticides? What are natural pesticides? If you actually look at the compounds in our fruits and vegetables, a large number of these naturally occurring secondary products, about 10,000 or so, are natural pesticides. Because plants don't want to be eaten by insects and herbivores. That's us. So plants don't want to be eaten by us, so they produce compounds to try to make them taste bitter or unpleasant, and that's basically what these naturally occurring compounds are. And when you test these naturally occurring compounds in exactly the same way as you test synthetic pesticides, on average about 50% of them will give you a result of being carcinogenic at high concentrations. So am I telling you don't eat fruits and vegetables? Absolutely not. I'm telling you the doses that we eat these things at are so below the risk level that they fade into insignificance. And the quantity of average pesticides consumed per day of natural pesticides in our food outweighs synthetic pesticide residues by about 20,000 to 1. So if you're worried about pesticides, then it doesn't make sense to focus on one category of pesticides when 20,000 to 1 it's the natural pesticides. And in fact, the results show that when you use these tests and assumptions to identify synthetic pesticide traces as damaging to humans, it lacks meaningful interpretation because the consumption of natural pesticides does not induce cancer. In fact, it reduces your risk by 50%. So in other words, eat more fruits and vegetables and don't focus on these insignificant risks, because the data on fruit and vegetable consumption is such a solid piece of data, and yet so few of people actually take in the recommended daily amount. And neither organic nor conventionally grown foods are free from pesticides, but the health risks are considered to be much higher from foodborne pathogens. That actually does kill 3,000 people a year. And so we kind of have our risk estimates all out of whack in this regard. And if we look over time, has the toxicity of agricultural pesticides increased or decreased? And farmers in the room would be able to very clearly answer that question. And here we are back in the 1960s. This was not a great time in agriculture. There were some pretty toxic herbicides and pesticides and insecticides being used, but they have, over time, been removed, banned, you name it, such that actually the toxicity of the pesticides used in agriculture today is way, way, way lower than it was back in the 1960s. A little tiny bit of this has been due to the introduction of GMOs here in about 1996, but this has been due to changing over to safer chemistries. And the persistence and rate has decreased over time as well. And I think that sometimes urban audiences particularly don't really get that if you can't use chemicals to control weeds, what often happens is, and this is a California picture, of farm workers controlling weeds. And that's possible in a tomato row. Becomes very difficult in a corn crop, as you would appreciate here. But there's also, if you're really interested in sustainability, there has to be some consideration given to this job, which, if anyone's ever weeded fields, not the funnest job on earth, especially in our climate in California. And that's a real human trade-off that's associated with not using chemicals. And so I think there's a lot to this. And let's just compare, and I think this is kind of an interesting comparison. So back in the 1700s, there were about 500 million people on Earth. In 1993, there was about 5.5 billion people on Earth. That's an 11-fold increase in humans. And our cropland went from 270 million hectares to 1,400. So there was only a 5.5-fold increase in cropland to address an 11-fold increase in human beings. And why is that? That's because agriculture became more efficient. So we were able to produce more food on each acre of cropland, and so we needed to bring less cropland into production as a result of that increased efficiency. And this graph here takes this 1993 level of 1,450 million hectares and compares it to what it was like in 1961. And in 1961, there were about 3 billion people, and in 1993 went up about 1.8-fold to 5.5 billion, but there was almost no increase in the amount of land under crops to address another 2.5 billion people on Earth. And part of the reason for that was because we were able to take technology that enabled us to increase food production without taking more land under cultivation. And one of the very real consequences of taking technology out of this discussion is we would need more land in order to grow the same amount of food. And if you look here, it really is a pretty amazing picture from 1961. If you hold that as a year of beginning, so that 100% food prices dropped on average about 50%, and cereal yields increased about 200 or doubled, if you will. And so decreased food prices, increased yields, using less land to feed 2.5 million people, that's, to me, the direction we want to head. We don't want to go in the other direction. And so let's just say we got rid of all pesticides, fertilizer, and irrigation. We would need about 90% more cropland if we weren't using any pesticides. If we weren't using any fertilizer, we'd need about 400 to 600 additional million hectares of cropland. And without all three, we would have to plow up an extra 200 million hectares of cropland, which is more than all of the cropland that was under the plow in 1993. That is not a sustainable solution. And so I think these trade-offs are so important when we're thinking about what we use in our agricultural production systems. The consequences of less efficient agriculture would be the elimination of wilderness that by any measure of biodiversity far exceeds that of any kind of farming system. And that's just a truth that we see. So I'm going to finish up with a discussion around my favorite topic, because it seems I always talk around this topic, which is breeding, and in this case, genetically modified organisms. And the reason I spend a lot of time on this is, of all the politicized topics that there are on Earth, it seems, the safety of genetically modified foods is the biggest disconnect between where the average adult is and the average scientist is. There's a 51-point gap. How did we get there? Did my mum just wake up one morning and say, gosh, I wonder what breeding method those farmers in Iowa are using on their soybeans? That's not how it happens. It happens through this, because if you search the internet, and God knows social media and the internet has brought amazing progress, but it's also brought this disinformation campaign from hell that basically targets the very things we love most in the world, our children, and makes you scared about GMOs. But as my good friend Abraham Lincoln says, you know, don't believe everything you read on the internet just because there's a picture with a quote next to it. And I think it's really concerning to me. It's been perplexing to me, because I've been in this field about 20 years. This whole debate, it's like, normally debates happen and then they go to bed. You know, the pasteurization debate happened, but it's coming back, I guess. And I see a lot of these debates coming back, the vaccination discussion. But this one never died, and it just kept coming and coming and coming. And what I found really interesting was Iowa State just came out with a study showing that about half of the articles that show GMOs in a negative light are coming out of Russian media. And I think that everyone maybe has a little bit more appreciation how you might utilize social media and our openness of media to start to influence public opinion now in a way that perhaps we didn't appreciate a couple of years ago. And I think that, you know, this is a really interesting statistic, but I just want to talk about the fact that there are about 18 million farmers globally growing genetically engineered crops. And what this graph shows is, since they were adopted in '96 through to the current day, this is the acreage that's gone under genetically engineered crops, so about 444 million acres. But what I think, the total is bigger than that. Well, this is in hectares, 200 million hectares. But what I find really interesting is this unknown factoid, and that is about 90% of the farmers growing GMO crops are not in America or the developed world, they're in the developing world. And there's small-scale farmers that are growing insect-protected cotton or eggplant in the case of Bangladesh. That basically has dramatically reduced insecticide use for those farmers. And those farmers, as I mentioned, are typically putting that stuff on in the absence of any personal protective equipment. And so 90% of the farmers that are growing this are actually developing countries farmers. So what crops are GE in the US? So corn, cotton, soy, sugar beet. This should be not new knowledge to an Iowa crowd. Apples, potatoes were approved recently, canola, papaya, some squash, melons, sweet corn, and alfalfa hay. Non-GEO crops include everything else, and nothing infuriates me more than going onto the internet and seeing how GMO wheat is giving people celiac disease. It's just not a thing. It's just not a thing at all. And so neither rice, barley, none of these. And so when I go in the supermarket and I see that dang butterfly on olives and tomatoes and oysters and almond butter and black beans and biscotti, cinnamon buns, I'm like, what are we saying here? You know what it's saying to me is, I am a marketer, and I am going to charge you more by scaring you to make you think that my competitors' cinnamon buns contain GMOs, and I know you're a health-conscious person because you're buying cinnamon buns, and that basically is the deal here, because there are no GMO products here, and you know, I've decided to start my own company, and so I'm going to verify the non-unicorn projects, and basically my idea is that I can ask money, an increased amount of money, for products that brandish an absence label, even though that thing didn't exist in the first place. And if people don't get that this is the most cynical marketing scheme on the history of the planet in terms of asking you to pay more money for something that wasn't there in the first place by putting a label on there, I don't know what is. But the trouble is it has real consequences. So what does non-GMO milk mean? Milk's milk. It comes from cows. What this means is the farmer feeding that cow wasn't able to use genetically engineered feed to feed his cows. And I know farmers that grow genetically engineered feed in California, and we just had a couple of counties recently ban GMOs. So I asked the farmers, what are you going to do? Plant conventional corn, and I'll go back, and I think farmers can correct me, I think he was going to use atrazine instead to control his broadleaf weeds instead of Roundup. Well, the toxicity of atrazine relative to Roundup is a no-brainer. It's much, much, much more toxic. So that farmer now and his family are exposed to more risk because someone wants to have that on their milk and feel like they're doing the right thing by their kids, but they've actually put, it's a social justice issue, they put the risk onto the farmer that's producing that milk. Now, of course, they're going to get more, it'll be more expensive, but the consequence of this is you've actually taken a technology that has had a huge reduction in the environmental footprint of ag production. And I don't know why this message is so hard to get out there, but globally, as I mentioned a minute ago, there's been a 56% decrease in global insecticide use on cotton. That is hard to put into perspective because cotton is a very widely grown crop, and insecticides tend to be one of the more dangerous pesticides that are used. 56% decrease. So if I suddenly want non-GMO cotton, what will happen? Well, the opposite of this, right? So they've reduced global pesticide spraying, and I don't need to tell an Iowa audience that as a result of the adoption of Roundup Ready crops, it alters the tillage pattern required. You can do no-till, and that also has greenhouse gas savings, not only because you're not tilling the soil, but also a reduction in fuel use that's about the equivalent of moving 17 million cars from the roads. So why would you be against that technology and purchase a product that says, this is not what I want to see? And for me, the more important social justice issue is this, because a recent study came out looking at the cost of, if I'm a family of 4 in America and I want to buy solely non-GMO produce for my family, on average, the family food budget increase would be in the ballpark of about $10,000 extra per year. And I just stand back from that and I go, okay, we're not going to use this breeding method. The farmers are going to have a safe technology taken away. They're going to have to use different chemicals to control the pests that otherwise would eat our lunch. Like the farmer's job is to protect our lunch for humans. They're going to be, that's a detriment to the environment. The crops will be less productive. That's a detriment to the environment. And we've increased food on the people that are least likely able to afford this type of increase. Because what's happening is that the fear-mongering around pesticides and GMOs is making people actually avoid produce like fruits and vegetables. And as a mother, you know, preying on a parent's instinctive desire to protect the health of their children by using lies to scare them into paying more money for absence-label foods, or worse, to avoid fresh produce altogether due to misguided fears around GMOs and pesticides, is just about the most unethical and disingenuous way I can imagine to increase market share. And to me, this is just a total scam on the consumer because it's basically marketing to fear because people don't know that actually that's what's happening. And I think this misinformation is really one of the most damaging things that can happen to overall ag sustainability. So let's focus on real risks and cut the fear-mongering. We're focused on the wrong things. So eating fruits and vegetables cuts your rate of cancer in half. Eat fruits and vegetables, and don't worry what production system was used to grow them. From a public health perspective, bugs, foodborne illnesses are actually where the widespread health risks are. Let's focus our resources on that. In addition, things like heavy metals and mycotoxins are of real concern in animal feed, and they pose potential food contaminants that have genuine risks to human health. These documented risks are in stark contrast to the available data, suggesting that there are no risks associated with GMO food on the market, and yet so much energy and time and press attention goes to this non-existent risk and kind of ignores these other very real risks that we actually could do something to address.